It's my absolute pleasure to be here with Danny this afternoon to, bring us home through the graveyard shift. Just before we do start, though, I do have one disclosure I do need to make in relation to Nick's golf effect. I will be playing golf tomorrow. It is quite unusual. It's actually in support of a charity day that I'm chairing. So if you see me on LinkedIn tomorrow promoting the Property Industry Foundation Charity Day, that's why. It's not me skiving off for the day. So look, I guess to get started, as I said, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Danielle into this session. And I was sitting there at about 10:30 last night thinking, well, I need to get some introductory comments together and some questions together. And I thought, well, thinking all things productivity, I thought, hold on, ChatGPT. So I thought, sorry, can you hear me? Is that better? Can you hear me better now? So I thought what I'll do is I'll put in a quick prompt into ChatGPT, and that prompt was, prepare an introductory bio for Danielle Wood, Chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. ChatGPT's response, and I quote, as of my last knowledge update, I don't have specific information about Danielle Wood being the Chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. Up until that point, Michael Brennan was the Chair. So needless to say, I closed down ChatGPT and got back to my usual Googling and looking around. And I won't obviously dwell on Danielle's career and the various roles and the achievements that she's had, because we'll be here for most of this session before we even get halfway through. So look, where to start? I guess for me and everyone at Urbis, and for those that don't know, Urbis spends most of our time sort of working in cities and communities. Productivity is a daily issue, and that's a daily issue whether or not we're dealing with delivering sustainable and viable products. It's an issue whether or not we're dealing with the intersection of the complex web of local, state and federal policy and legislation. It's an issue when we're dealing in the policy space around the delivery of services, education, justice and opportunities for diverse communities, or whether it's more in the finance space where we're working with local and offshore capital to encourage them to invest in Australian projects. For me, I still regularly ponder why in Australia we're governing cities of the 21st century with 18th century and 19th century governance models. I think we've heard it loud and clear today, we just have to move forward on some of these things. And there's many issues that have been covered today and many more that Danny will now talk to. So please keep the questions coming. We've just got a couple of questions to get us started, but please keep the questions coming on Pigeonhole, and we'll start putting those to Danny shortly. But to get us started, Danny, I guess productivity is obviously front and centre of the agenda at the moment, and Australia's experiencing a period of low productivity. To set the scene, can you talk to Australia's performance, say, over the last 20 to 30 years from a productivity perspective? What got us through that period in the way that it did, and where we're sitting now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it certainly is front and centre, and I understand that lots of talk about productivity this morning. We're hearing a lot from the Reserve Bank Governor and others. I say to my colleagues at the Commission who've been thinking about productivity for decades now, we were into the band before it was cool. So it's nice to see everyone come on board, but of course the reason everyone is on board is because when you don't have productivity growth, it's very evident that it has pretty significant impacts for our living standards. So to your question on the sort of the history of productivity growth, Matt, even if we take a slightly longer time series, we had really strong productivity growth through the 60s and 70s. We sort of then fell off in the 80s, which was very sort of standard global pattern. We had strong growth through the 90s, and in fact, again, globally that was the pattern, but Australia performed particularly well, so we sort of stood out during that period. And then really since the turn of this century, it's petered off. And particularly if we take the decade post-GFC, labour productivity here at that point was growing at about 1.1% a year on average across that decade. That compares to that 60-year average of 1.7%. So really kind of stagnant in the pre-COVID world. Again, that's not just an Australian phenomenon. We saw that same slowdown right around the developed world, although Australia lagged even more so than many other advanced economies. So, what that really says to me is One, there's a lot of common factors driving that productivity story. So impact of technology, obviously lots of tech is global, and so that waxes and wanes in terms of its impact on productivity as there's new developments and they diffuse. Second, there's a lot of similar structural drivers. So one of the big ones that the PC's written a lot about is the shift in the sort of sectoral composition of the economy as we've moved our workforce away from areas like mining and agriculture and manufacturing, which have tended to be high productivity sectors. To some extent, it's the fact that they are high productivity that's actually shifted resources over time. Big growth in the services sector. 9 out of 10 Australians now employed in services. Productivity gains have been harder to come by in those sectors. And again, that's the kind of international story. That's not to say that nothing we do here matters. Of course, at the edges, the way business performs in adopting new technologies, the way government policy sets up to enable growth, to help resources move around the economy, they will all matter for how Australia compares given those structural trends.
So when we look at that, would you say we're in a cyclical downward position with productivity, or is this more a structural issue that we're dealing with at the moment?
Well, if we look at the numbers right now, they do not spark joy for someone who leads an organisation called the Productivity Commission. Labour productivity growth till September last year, which is the most recent data we have, actually shrunk. So we reduced by 2.1%, which is why we are hearing so much about it. I think that is largely cyclical. So there's a couple of effects going on there. We had COVID lockdowns, which kind of counterintuitively, I should say, we shut down mainly lower productivity services sectors, so we saw productivity go up in the first year or so of COVID. Then as we reopened, it came back down again. We've had a really strong labour market, unemployment with a 3 in front. That's a great thing, but we're bringing in lots of more marginal workers that will take time to train. We've had a reopening of our borders and a huge surge in migration. Lots of international students in that group. Where they are working, they tend to be working in the services sectors, which are lower productivity. So big expansion in working hours. That's tended to happen in the services sector. Capital stock hasn't kept up. So all of that has led to the kind of negative number that we're seeing. I am not in the business of economic forecasting, but if I were to put a forecast out there, that September number, quarterly, we saw an increase. I think the next number will be up. I think we will be moving back into positive territory as those cyclical effects work their way through. The big question really is, what are we recovering to? Are we going to go back to that stagnant kind of pre-COVID world, or might we recover to something better?
Okay. We've just heard about what's happening globally with work from home, hybrid working, the impacts. Interestingly, I would say our business is nearly the poster child for what Nick presented. I reckon we're literally bang on, probably most people doing between 1.5 to 2 days a week, and it works. And I think our staff are generally happy with it, and we're maintaining productivity. For Australia, and when you look around the country and see how we're adapting to work from home and hybrid working and so forth, what do you think the impacts in our economy, in our society, are going to be in that realm?
Look, it's a great question. It's wonderful to follow Nick on this topic, who's very much shaped my own thinking on it right through the pandemic. I mean, I think there's actually an interesting lesson in how we make associations in our public policy discourse. So, we were just talking about negative productivity growth here. That has led some people, I think, to say, well, we've had this big structural shift towards working from home. We can see we've got this terrible productivity performance. It must be working from home. Whereas in the US, they're further ahead of us in this curve. Their productivity growth is looking quite healthy. People have said, working from home must be good for productivity. The same shift has led people to speculate differently according to various other things that are going on in the economy. I mean, we have seen the shift, as Nick said, that they've seen in other countries. 37% of Australians now work from home on a regular basis, at least some of the time. About a quarter of total days are worked from home. When I look at the work that Nick and some of the other studies that he put up there it reassures me, I think, that this is not going to be a big drag in productivity over time. The fact that it's kind of a wash when it comes to firm productivity is a positive. It seems to offer a range of benefits in terms of flexibility for employees. Commute times really matter, as Nick said. And here, if you're commuting in Sydney or Melbourne, you'll be spending, on average, more than an hour a day commuting to the office. That is expensive in terms of time, it's expensive in terms of money. And, you know, one of the other benefits that I don't think I heard Nick touch on for business, I think, is the opportunity to employ people that otherwise might not have been able to work in a world where you had to be in the office all the time. And the CEDA publication that came out today, I think, had some fantastic analysis of, you know, the period post-COVID. Where were some of those labour force gains coming from? They were coming for women with children under 4, they were coming from carers, they were coming from people with a disability. And I think that's actually a really exciting element of this greater flexibility, that from both an economic and a social perspective, that we may be able to create more diverse workplaces. So I think that should be part of the conversation as well. So my overall read is I'm not at all panicked that this is going to be a long-term drag. I think how we manage it matters. As Nick says, there's better and worse ways to structure it to make sure that you maintain the output of the particular business and that you have the oversight, you have the systems, you have the management practices and processes. You know, managing in a hybrid sense is different to managing when you're in the office all the time. But if we can get it right and if business can find that sweet spot, I think, if anything, there's upside.
So just on that theme of work, our cities, you know, at Urbis we spend all of our time sort of working through the potential of our cities. We've seen the government now set some really major stretch objectives in terms of housing growth and housing supply, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. Do you think there will be productivity boosts through, or productivity gains through boosting housing supply? And particularly if you have a view on what type of housing supply might drive the most productivity. And then coupled with that also just your view on the construction sector, where we probably haven't seen a lot of productivity growth over a fairly significant period of time because of a lack of innovation.
Look, I think housing supply is probably one of the underappreciated levers for productivity. And the reason I say that is, as you know, and you spend a lot of your life thinking about, Matt, you know, our cities have kind of been these big productivity engines. For all the reasons we talked about, that face-to-face component of work is important. When you bring together businesses and suppliers and customers and experts all in one place, you get these kind of broader spillover benefits. You get a big labour pool of people that you can attract. So we have a lot of very productive, very high-paid jobs that cluster in our cities. And when you constrain the capacity to add more people close to those jobs, you constrain the ability for that productivity growth to happen. So I'm super excited that we see a number of state governments as well as the Commonwealth Government really focusing on this issue of housing supply. I think it is long overdue. You know, where we really want to see the houses are in areas that are close to those jobs and close to amenities. So that's kind of the inner middle ring suburbs. Part of that process has begun, but a lot of suburbs are still locked up. Increasing supply and allowing more people to move in will be incredibly important. The New South Wales Productivity Commission actually had a really interesting report on this, I think it was earlier this week, and you may have heard the Commissioner out there saying that Sydney at the moment is in danger of becoming the city without grandchildren, which is a very clever line, very sad line, but what it's indicating is, you know, if we don't get this right, increasingly young people will be forced out of our major cities. So yes, it's a big lever. Yes, the government is being ambitious, including the federal government putting money on the table for states to encourage them to meet those housing supply targets. I think by all accounts, and you would know this better than me, they're going to be pretty hard to meet. We do have immediate challenges in the construction sector. It's been very disrupted by COVID and supply chain issues and cost of inputs. We've seen a number of firms go to the wall So it's certainly a challenging time for the sector to ramp up, as it will need to if it's going to meet those targets. On the longer term productivity question, you're exactly right. It's not been a sector that in any way has shot the lights out in terms of productivity growth. It's lagged since around the mid-90s in Australia. It's lagged manufacturing and mining and agriculture when it comes to productivity improvements. We see the same thing around the world, actually, interestingly, this kind of question of why construction productivity has been so low. If you go to the US, I think they've actually gone backwards in terms of productivity over the last couple of decades.
Does that have anything to do with, this devaluation of the trades and lack of investment that's occurred, particularly in Australia and over the last decade, in non-tertiary education in and around the trades? Because it does seem to be an area where that access to skilled work and trained workers for the construction sector is a real issue.
Yeah, that certainly can be a choke point, and I know there are many areas like electricians and other things where we've struggled to create the pipeline of workers that we need. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had around the way we use our migration system. There are actually very few migrants work in construction at the moment. It's very hard if you come here as a skilled migrant with a trade to get recognition of that trade. It's a long process and a very costly process. So I think there's scope for improvement there. So that may be one thing that's going on. Basically, there's a lot of discussion of what it be. It could be restrictions around land use planning. It's been an industry that's been slow to adopt new technology. There's a lot of exciting opportunities around things like prefabrication, where you kind of basically build components of the building in a factory, then ship it to site. That can be much more efficient. It can be much more energy efficient as well. Some parts of the world have really kind of nudged their industry in that direction through using policy levers. So that may be an area where there's scope to make gains. The other challenge is it's a lot of kind of small bespoke stuff. And there's a really interesting policy in Victoria. Again, you'll probably know more about it than me, but it creates a series of kind of standard designs that if you have a block, you can create these kind of medium density designs. You have an expedited planning process. And I suspect, if you start building in a more standard way, there's then scope for learning and creating greater efficiency.
Yeah, we haven't really seen that come through in a meaningful way yet, but I agree.
It's a relatively new policy.
It's a relatively new policy, and I agree. If we start to be able to standardise a few things, but then dealing at probably the local government level will be a different issue. Let's take it from the physical world to the virtual world. AI, lots of discussion about AI and how it will help us in the future. Didn't help me a lot last night. It gave me a bit of a gag for the intro. What are your thoughts about AI productivity? Are you optimistic? And particularly, what do we need to do in the Australian context to get the most out of AI?
Look, I am optimistic, and I've actually found myself kind of increasingly optimistic over the last couple of years as we've just seen the technology and how generative AI in particular has developed over that time. We don't see it kind of feeding through into the productivity numbers yet, as we've already talked about, but that's not surprising. Every technology takes a while for business to work out how to harness it and how to change its processes to deal with it. So we call it kind of the J curve, and I expect we're kind of sitting at the bottom of that curve at the moment, and there is a lot of upside. It's really exciting from an economic perspective. One, because it's a general purpose technology, and what that means is it potentially touches, many parts of the economy and can transform many parts of the economy, including the services sectors. So we talked before about how services are kind of hard to shift the dial on. When you look at the potential use cases for AI, whether it's education or health or even cafes and restaurants, there are ways in which we could see it potentially improving productivity across a range of sectors of the economy. The second thing about it that's really exciting is it's not just about driving efficiency of individual tasks, although we've got a heap of great studies showing how it can make you a faster coder or a writer or make your call centre operations better. It potentially changes the course of innovation itself. So if you can develop new technologies more quickly, or you can find new health discoveries more quickly, you can imagine that, you know, this is not just kind of a series of little shifts in productivity, kind of actually shifting the curve itself. So that is incredibly exciting. What stands in our way? One thing that I think is really important is this question of diffusion. So how fast do we pick it up in our businesses? And when we look at how Australia performs, we do pretty well when it comes to generalised innovation, so things like websites or cloud computing. We're relatively fast adopters. When it comes to more advanced tech, so things like data analytics, things like AI, at least based on the most recent international comparisons we have, we tend to be lagging a lot of our developed country counterparts. So if you kind of plot us on the OECD, we sit pretty much at the bottom of the pack. So I think there is a challenge there in terms of our management capability. We see it in surveys. Our managers feel less capable in identifying the tech that's relevant, in rolling out that tech in their businesses. CEDA did an interesting piece on, you know, small business management capability and what kind of training might be helpful in that regard. I think there's lots of interesting conversations there.
Do you think that's an education issue, you know, a ground-up education issue through school, tertiary education and so forth? Or is part of it just a complacency that we've had this magnificent run for virtually the last 30 years of economic growth, and that we haven't been pushed into that position where we really need to innovate and take on new technologies at a faster rate?
Yeah, look, I think it partly is kind of the sort of cultural, business cultural environment, if you like. If you look at some of the smaller countries that are super innovative, you know, Israel, Estonia, those ones kind of come up. Often they're ones that are very, for geopolitical reasons, they have a lot of urgency to their task. I used to make the joke, you know, you go to those AFR summits and everyone's complaining about the government and what the government's doing or not doing, and I'm like, if we were in Silicon Valley, do you think we'd be talking about that, or we'd be talking about who's got the greatest new thing that they're rolling out and learning from that? So I think that there may be a kind of cultural component, but education and training matters as well. A few other things that are going to matter. One is just the skilled staff that can use the tech. We've written a lot about how a lot of that workforce is going to have to come from the existing workforce, so retraining our existing workers. So we're really excited about the kind of growth in micro-credentials and recognition of that through the skills passport. There are the kind of enablers. Do we have the internet and the capacity that we're going to need to make it happen? We see at the moment in regional areas, at least, particularly ag, says that internet speeds are a barrier to them engaging in technological innovation. And then we've got the question of government regulation, and we put out a report on this a few weeks ago at the Commission. What we said really is, of course, there are a lot of risks with these technologies, you know, whether it's privacy, whether it's discrimination, whether it's OH&S. There are a whole suite of things we can think about that could be a concern in the world of AI. But what we need to be careful to do is to, you know, really specify what it is we are worried about. Think about whether existing regulations might cover off on those concerns before we kind of jump in to regulate first. Where we think there are some concerns with this technology that aren't covered by our existing suite of regulations, trying as much as possible to move towards global standards. We are not the only country in the world grappling with these issues right now. What we don't want to do is kind of cut off this, nascent tech, which is potentially transformative, before we have the chance to kind of climb that curve. So getting the regulatory settings right will be really important.
Just a touch earlier, you mentioned the difference between here and perhaps Silicon Valley, and it relates to one of our first questions, which has got the most votes. Lucy Ellis, I'm not sure if you saw Lucy's presentation. She made the comment, and this relates to this question, about one of the problems in Australia is that we look at productivity and the private sector says that's a government issue to solve. And the question is, how do we change the narrative around productivity, and how do we make the challenge real for all of us, not just standing back and handing it over to government to solve through policy changes?
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, it is real because it goes to the heart of the profitability of our business sector. And as we increasingly compete in a global environment, we kind of have to be there towards the front of the curve. So I think, ultimately the broader market forces push us in that direction. How do we shift the culture? That's a really hard question.
It's a big one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, so it's, it's how you celebrate success. It's how we, think about what good looks like. That's actually, I think, a broader question for business.
Well, it's an interesting one too. When you look back over the last couple of years, and I think the stats show that business investment, private sector investment, has been quite low over the last couple of years, despite relatively good conditions, and that we're clearly not investing in the future, and we're not investing in innovation, and we're not investing in productivity enough. So it does seem there needs to be a real mind shift in the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, there's, in the kind of pre-COVID world, when I was talking about the sort of sluggish productivity, there was some really interesting debates there. As you say, business investment was really in the toilet, and we saw companies giving back, huge amounts of dividends to shareholders. There's a sense that people have got used to that, and the company owners kind of expect now these level of dividend returns that are just not consistent with putting money back into investment and growth. So again, that's a broader mindset shift and sort of an expectations in financial markets that we'll probably need to shift if we are going to undertake, what is going to have to be sizable investments in some of the big challenges that we face. Green transition we haven't spoken about. That is a massive transformation of our economy and how we do things. There will be significant amounts of investment required, which is going to involve businesses having to kind of really take some of those big long-term risks.
There's a question here from Andrew Weir relating to economic growth. You made the comment earlier, and this is what Andrew's noted as well, that much of our economic growth, much of our economic engines is in the services sector, it's in our cities. But why are we constantly getting the productivity debate around in this country being focused on transport infrastructure? We seem transfixed with building roads and other things when it's not necessarily driving the productivity that we need.
So I think Andrew's right that there was a lot of focus on transport infrastructure in the kind of pre-COVID and even in the stimulus response to COVID. We do have a relatively rapidly growing population, so there is certainly a case for investing in transport infrastructure. How we do it, I think, has left a lot to be desired, and my former colleagues at Grattan have done, I think, a really good job at cataloguing how it is that we made decisions that more on political grounds than on valid kind of cost-benefit grounds. So reorientating the spend, including things, local roads rather than mega projects, could make a big difference there. But to the broader conversation, I think Andrew's right. We don't always think about investment in our social infrastructure in the same way that we have the physical infrastructure. Again, I go back to that COVID period. We were looking to stimulate. We spent a lot of money investing in kind of physical infrastructure projects when it was a services-led downturn. The services sectors were the ones that were doing it tough, and we don't have a good framework, I think, for thinking about how we make those public sector investments in those areas in the same way. So I think the conversation is evolving. We spend a lot of time at the PC talking about services, but we need to kind of shift the broader policy debate out of the 1980s mindset.
So let's flick from services to manufacturing and another question. Can we and should we rebuild Australia's manufacturing sector? I know, and I've read a lot of Ross Garnaut's work that said if we get sustainable energy right, and clean energy right, we should be able to produce energy in this country at a much lower cost than anybody else, which by virtue of that would help reinflate and refund the manufacturing sector. How critical is it to our future, do you think, and our productivity?
Look, I think we can in the same way we can kind of fetishise infrastructure, we sometimes fetishise manufacturing and manufacturing jobs. So should we try and restore manufacturing for the sake of it? No, I don't think that would be a good policy at all. Ross's point is slightly more subtle than that, which is really in a world where we have moved to green production, reliant on renewable energy sources. Australia is going to have, by virtue of our incredible wind and solar resources, an advantage in the production of cheap energy. And it may be in that world that there are certain production processes that become much more economic to happen here. So green steel is one example. You know, at the moment we export the iron ore, we export the coal. It's just economic for that to be produced offshore. In a world where the energy input is green hydrogen, which is much more expensive to transport, that creates an opportunity for us to be a major supplier of green steel product to the world. So yes, I think there are opportunities in the green economy in manufacturing. We should, to the extent we're talking about government support, we should be very focused on those areas where we're likely to have a long-term comparative advantage. We shouldn't be trying to recreate every kind of manufacturing sector here just because we think it's going to create local jobs, because we're going to end up diverting resources from things that we're good at if we do that, and end up spending a lot of taxpayers' money.
Changing tact a little bit, there's a question here that's come up just around wages growth and productivity growth, and just noting that over the past decade wages growth didn't keep pace with productivity growth, which probably helped us keep inflation low, and that sort of lower for longer argument. In that context, does it still make sense to say that wages growth is dependent on productivity growth?
Look, yes, it does make sense, and certainly if you kind of look at the long arc, they do tend to move together. The questioner is right that there has been, to some degree, some decoupling, as the economists like to call it, which basically just means wages haven't grown as fast as productivity over the past decade. What that largely reflects is the mining and the agricultural sector. So we find that the vast bulk of that decoupling is in those two particular sectors. There are some very unique factors in those sectors, particularly in mining. As we know, there's been a huge ramp up in international prices. A lot of Australian firms have been very profitable. Wages haven't kind of followed that curve up. So that's driven a lot of that experience over the past 10 years. Over time, we will continue to see wages track productivity, because that's the only way it can really make economic sense. So yes, we do need to think about productivity if we want to see wages grow over the medium and long term.
Okay, we've got a question here from Joe, and this question relates to that we're now starting to see some companies trial 4-day weeks at 100% pay, with the view that you can achieve the same level of productivity in the 4-day weeks. Joan, first question she asks is, will this be beneficial for inclusiveness, families, childcare, etc.? But also, I'd just like to add, what's your view, and where do you think that agenda around the potential 4-day week being the full-time week, do you think it's got legs, and do you think it's an immovable force that's coming our way that we're all going to have to deal with?
Look, I think it's really early days. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and they had the head of HR at Medibank, who's one of the companies that's trialling this at the moment. And it is just a trial. It's a very kind of small number of people in the workforce. All of the trials that I have seen have been premised on the idea of, as you say, 4 days, but 100% productivity. So it only works in a world where you think you can transform the way people do their jobs such that they are now able to fit what they did previously over 5 into 4 days. I think there's a big question mark for how many jobs that is going to be possible and true of. I looked at a lot of these trials when I was at Grattan. I was like, oh, maybe we could have a 4-day week. And what I realised is it works well in places where you have a lot of unnecessary meetings. There are kind of unnecessary workflows that you can cut back on. If you're already pretty lean, it's kind of hard to cut your hours without cutting into your productivity. So I do think it's early days. I do think it may work in some cases. On the question of diversity and inclusion, clearly I think anything that makes work more flexible is going to be strong on that front. I've just got a big question mark about how translatable it's going to be across the kind of broad set of jobs.
Do you think the employees are just going to demand 4 days though? If they start to see it come onto the horizon, so it might not even be a productivity issue, but do you think we're moving? Because I do think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is people have taken their lives back a bit, which by and large is a good thing, and we're seeing a lot more people work remotely, work hybridly, work part-time. Do you think we're just going to end up in a position where 4 days becomes the new 5?
I think we'd have to be much further down this road. I mean, there clearly can be tipping points in certain industries where things become norm, and I think the Nick Bloom data on kind of what's the wage premium that you'd have to pay for someone to move from hybrid to fully in the office, I think is really interesting in that regard. But I don't think we're anywhere near that point in the process yet. And I think we should also remember that post-pandemic we've had incredibly strong labour markets. As I said, unemployment with a 3 in front. Employees have really had a lot of power in a way that they haven't for a very long time in this country where we've had a lot of labour market slack. We are starting to see a rebalancing in the labour market, so I think it's not clear that employees will be in the box seat in the way that they may have been in the last couple of years.
As always, Danny, when we're talking with you, we could go on forever, but time has flown and we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I guess just one final question for me to wrap up. The broad themes that you think from a broad policy perspective, and not to comment on current government policy, but from a broader issue, what do you think the big policy issues are, the big themes that we need to be thinking about in terms of driving productivity, short to medium term, but also probably more importantly with the theme of the day in the longer term, to ensure that we have longer-term sustainable productivity?
This one's always such a hard one to answer, Matt, because there's often this kind of sense in productivity debate that there's just this one lever, and if we could just pull this one thing, everything's going to be fine. It just doesn't work like that. I say it's a game of inches because we need to do a bit everywhere. So let me just pick a couple. One, actually, I will comment on current government policy. Is there actually, a number of significant changes underway that are things that I think are really good and that Productivity Commission and Grattan and others have advocated for a long time. We talked about housing supply being one. I touched on the migration changes. I think, reorientating our kind of skilled migration system so we are bringing in the workers that add the most value to the Australian economy. The government's announced that it will revamp national competition policy, which is when it gets together with the state government and looks at all the kind of impediments to competition and resource allocation in state government regulations, and the Commonwealth incentivises the states through payments to deal with those. So there's a number of bits happening. I'm really interested in how those reforms actually are implemented. So great to have the announcement, very positive directions, you've got to make it stick. So in the short term, some of those things I'm actually really focused on. How do we make sure those things happen and happen well? In the long term, it's hard to go past education. In a services-based economy, human capital is everything. There's a Bill Gates quote that I like, which is, show me a country's education system and I'll show you where that country will be in 20 years' time. My former colleagues at Grattan put out a report last week showing that we are falling behind on the basics, on school education, on reading. We see a big divide as well between the advantaged and disadvantaged. A big push on making sure that we get the fundamentals right is going to set us up with the best chance of success for the longer horizon.
we're out of time. Thank you again. Your comments and insights are always leave us, I guess, better positioned to understand what's going on in the world. Very thought-provoking. So everyone, would you please join me in thanking Danny for her insights today. So we are just about done. So Danny and I will excuse ourselves, and Melinda's going to come up to wrap up today's proceedings.